Our next speaker and our last speaker for this panel, it is my delight to introduce, is my senior colleague here at the University of Virginia, Mehr Farooqi, is author and literary critic, drawn to translation, literary modernism, intersections between religion and literature, history, and art history. And I've linked to her website in the chat. Her many publications include Urdu Literary Culture, Vernacular Modernity in the Writing of Muhammad Hassan Askari, and very recently, her book Ghalib, A Wilderness at My Doorstep, a critical biography available now through Penguin and Alan Lane. Farooqi teaches at the University of Virginia, as I intimated, and today will be speaking to us about wounds of partition as symbolized in the fiction of Intizar Husain. Professor Farooqi, it's yours.
Thank you, Sonam, and also to Neeti for organizing this wonderful symposium. I just have to mention that I've changed the title of my paper. It's now The Roots of the Present Are in the Past, recapitulating partition through Intizar Husain's novel Basti. So basically, I'm going to be talking about the presentness of the past as presented by Intizar Husain. The progressive writers' movement in Urdu had produced the bulk of writing on India's partition. Progressivism believed in social realism, Samaji Haqiqat Nigari, as the sacred duty of writers. According to Mahmud Hashmi, the most acerbic and pugnacious of Urdu modernist literary critics, the progressive binary of good and bad moments in life was depicted in the literature that they produced. For these writers, details, that is juziyat, of social and external events were enough to create literature. The foundation of this method was not the writer's sensibility. They believed that simply awareness or mushahida was enough to produce literature. That is why they pushed Manto, the well-known Urdu fiction writer, from the progressive circle when he began to search for the self in his fiction. Thus, progressive novels and stories are important from the historical social point of view, but less from a literary perspective. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit. So I'm going to sort of, in order to be within the time limit, it cannot be denied that a new writing began to emerge as a counter to progressivism. This reaction was not just personal and individualistic. Its framework embraced social and political realities as well as literary perspectives. Mahmud Hashmi, whom I've referred to earlier, called the new writer's methodology the poetic method. The poetic method's basis was a sensibility or shaur that would transcend consciousness to mine the depths of the unconscious, in which the writer's sensibility becomes a mirror of consciousness, that is idrak, and reflects the environs, the present and the past. In the 1950s, Urdu's new writers adopted the poetic method so they could connect with the worldwide literary trends of symbolism, surrealism, and existentialism, and also they had a radical mindset. All this together can be broadly understood as modernism in Urdu. Because Urdu had declined in India after partition, the new writers published in Pakistani journals. In Pakistan, the suppression of democracy had led their writers to use the modernist diction in their work. Thus, a shared diction in Urdu modernism was created. This diction became a meeting point for writers across the border. New writers in Pakistan were gripped with nostalgia, while Indian Urdu writers, all the while confined to their language, wanted to express those horrific experiences hidden in their subconscious. The new writers did not suffer from the self-confidence or khud yaqini of the progressives. Their writing was the expression of their inward loneliness or zehni tanhai. Their writing was opaque and obscure. In India, the new writers felt exiled from their language because their language was declining. In Pakistan, the writers felt exiled because after partition, their connection with civilizational foundations had been severed. They were in search of their roots. At this time, Intizar Hussain published his path-breaking essay, Hamare Ahad Ka Adab, the literature of our times, in which he asked the burning question, quote, what is the past? When one ponders on this, then history, religion, ethnicity, mythology, old folk tales, beliefs, and fears all come into play. This convoluted, layered map makes the question very tangled, and for the new writers, it assumes the shape of a knot. Where are our roots? Hussain further elaborated. Before partition, we complained about the ills of our culture, but Hijrat scattered the foundations of our culture. In different regions, the different cultural receptacles, or sache, were broken. Cities and qasbas were lost to our sight. Writers such as Khurratullah and Haider, worried about the disappearance of this cultural map, became sad and wrote about it in a romantic way. Even the imagery of the ghazal changed. Nasir Kazmi evoked the Bastis and the Qasbas that now became memories of the civilizational repositories. Travel became a metaphor. And I quote Nasir Kazmi, जंगल में हुई है शाम हमको बस्ती से चले थे मुंह अंधेरे. Evening overtook us in the jungle. We left habitation at dawn. The experience of Hijrat brought a new kind of awareness. Human beings are not merely what they appear to be. Human relationships are spread more deeply inside us than outside us. Social reality is not self determining. It is born of a mingling of myriads of unconscious and conscious, lost and recovered realities. Eras or zamane are not two but three, and the three are entwined in tangles that cannot be separated or put in boxes. We breathe in the present, but our roots are in the past. In this paper, I want to revisit Partition and Intizar Husain's fiction through the lens of Urdu literary modernism. How did the new writers remember the wounds of this organic splitting of a common culture and memory? I propose to examine Intizar Husain's novel Basti to illustrate the ways in which writers like him encapsulate the experience of partition, an experience distinctly different from the progressives' literature of partition violence, Fasadat Ka Adab. The progressives had questioned the morals of violence. Modernist writers like Manto wrote of the violence with a view to study human nature. For Hussain, hijrat or migration became the instrument to excavate the centuries of civilizational beliefs, doubts, and belonging. After mourning the loss of the receptacles of culture, begins the search for the roots. According to Hussain, this search had a profound influence on literature. Things that were disliked became objects of amity. Unacceptable trends became acceptable. Religious beliefs, myths, stories of fairies and jinns that were once frowned upon now became suitable for literature. Intizar Hussain was born in Dubai, a township in Bulandshahr district of western Uttar Pradesh. His parents were Orthodox Shias. His father was a Maulvi, a preacher, a man who shunned modern ways. Hussein's early education was at home in classical Arabic and religious texts. When the family moved to Hapur, a bigger town, he was enrolled in a high school and eventually went to college in Meerut. When the riots of partition began, Hussain was in college and he felt a strange anxiety, as if something was slipping through his hands. His family migrated to Pakistan. In Lahore, he soon became a fiction writer. Hussein's friendship with the young poet Nasir Kazmi gave him hope that one could find a voice for the first literary generation of the new nation. Hussain wanted to convey the depths of the experience of migration. The novel Basti, published in 1979, is presumably set in Lahore, although the city is never named throughout the novel. The events in the novel take place in the few months preceding the traumatic second partition, that is the breaking of the eastern wing of Pakistan. The novel's protagonist is a young history professor, evocatively named Zakir, which means narrator. Zakir migrates with his parents to Lahore, leaving behind his childhood sweetheart and cousin Sabira. Sabira's older sister married, and her widowed mother, Zakir's maternal aunt, moved to East Pakistan. Sabira stubbornly refuses to go to Pakistan. She remains in India and works for All India Radio, and she never marries. Zakir too doesn't marry, but doesn't have the courage to go back to India to fetch her. The novel's events span only a few months, but the author captures a millennium and a half of history through flashbacks. There are references to Muslim South Asian history throughout the novel: the revolt of 1857 and the 1947 partition, the 1965 war between India and Pakistan, and finally the 1971 political disintegration of Pakistan and the emergence of Bangladesh. Basti has a complex structure. It is about remembrance. But the process of remembrance of the past is triggered by the events in the present. The novel begins with the Dastan like narrative of an enchanted make believe town, Rupnagar. When the world was all new, when the sky was fresh and the earth not still soiled, when trees breathed through centuries and ages spoke in the voice of birds, how astonished he was, looking all around, that everything was so new and yet looked so old. And in Urdu, जब दुनिया अभी नई थी, जब आसमान ताज़ा था और ज़मीन अभी मैली नहीं हुई थी, जब दरख्त सदियों में सांस लेते थे और परिंदों की आवाज़ में जुग बोलते थे, कितना हैरान होता था वो इर्द गिर्द को देखकर कि हर चीज़ कितनी नई और कितनी कदीम नज़र आ रही थी. If we read carefully, we become aware that from the very beginning, everything is in the past. The present is only to help understand the past with a different perspective and with new experiences. The present keeps merging into the past, and the past remains alive through memories. Thus, the present too is a discovery of the past. Zakir's childhood is painted with luminous colors and joy that is seldom seen in Husain's writing. Zakir asks about the beginning of creation. Bhagatji, the owner of a condiment shop who tells children stories of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, speaks to them about Brahmaji, and Sheshnag, how the earth rests on Sheshji's hood and Sheshji rests on the tortoise's back. Zakir asks Maulana, on what does the earth rest? Maulana answers, Mount Kaf. What surrounds Mount Kaf? Maulana replied, the seven earths. And what surrounds the seven earths? He replied, a serpent. And so it goes on. Zakir listens up when his father is answering questions about the end of the world. When will doomsday come? When the sun rises in the west. When will the sun rise in the west? When the hen crows and the rooster is mute. When will the hen crow and the rooster be mute? When those who can speak fall silent and shoelaces speak. When will those who can speak fall silent and shoelaces speak? When the rulers grow cruel and the people lick dust. Ominous events began to happen. Electricity comes to Rupnagar. It brings death to monkeys who had frolicked on the tree branches, but did not know that the electric wires are not for swinging. Monkeys disappear. Plague struck. Roaming in the forest adjoining Rupnagar, Zakir is suddenly afraid. There's something out there. His friend asks carelessly, who is it? A man, responds Zakir. They are afraid of men, of humans, the humans who loot homes, kill other humans, destroy habitation. Basti's structure is crafted such that the past is described in detail and the present only in snatches. As the novel gets closer to the present time, Husain takes recourse to a format of a diary for personal narrative of the wars. Zakir keeps a diary, but the events of the war are muddled. The entries create a tangled web of time between the revolt of 1857 and the 1965 war and the 1971 partition. So there are two excerpts from the diary, but you can see that the first one is from 1971, and then the second one is from 1857. So the first one. I don't know how many times the siren wailed. I was very much afraid. I was afraid for the city that I had endured so many sorrows, where I had sat and remembered Rupnagar so vividly, where I had kept it alive even now in my imagination. If a city is destroyed, the sufferings of those who live there are forgotten at the same time. The tragedy of this war-stricken time is that our sufferings don't manage to turn into memories. Excerpt 2. The red fort rang with silence. I went to the tomb of Hare Bhare Shah. The mad fakir wasn't there. Delhi is now a ruined city. Lanes that were like leaves from a painter's album have become laid waste. So many leaves are blown away with the wind. So many others have been erased. So many houses are lightless, reduced to rubble. Throughout the novel, the characters wait for Basharat, a sign or omen for better times. Zakir's grandmother Bi Amma has Basharat about the plague. As the novel draws to a close, Husain hints that an omen may be a possibility. Zakir's father, on his deathbed, gives him the bunch of keys to the old Haveli in Rupnagar. His mother says that they are trust from his forefathers and he should keep them, even though, quote, they are the keys to the house to which you no longer have any right, end quote. And then an excerpt. The keys are here with me, and there is a whole time locked up, a time that has passed. But time doesn't pass. It keeps passing, but it doesn't pass. It keeps hovering around, and houses never stay empty. When those who live in them go away, then time lives in them. Time lives on in the houses. Muhammad Omar Maiman, in his introduction to Basti, thinks that the hint of a basharat is a weakness in the novel. Asif Farooqi, who has written at length on Intizar Husain and has a compelling analysis on the closing chapter of the novel, disagrees with Maiman. In the closing chapters, the novel begins to fold upon itself. Time again sweeps from the Buddha through Karbala and the graveyard to where Zakir's father is buried. He has gone to visit his father's grave when riots break out in the city. He runs to his friend Afzal, who is visiting his grandmother's grave. They see graves and more graves, and now evening is falling. Husain uses the term Ashob, which means tumult or terror, for the times that they are in. People have grown cruel. Zakir and Afzal make their way back to a restaurant they frequented, called the Shiraz. There are scattered bricks and broken glass all around. Afzal speaks. यार ये तो वही ज़माना आ गया. जाकिर responds. उससे बुरा ज़माना, इसलिए कि जब वही ज़माना वापस आता है तो ज़्यादा बुरा हुआ करता है. These are the same times. Worse than that, when the same time returns, it's generally worse than what has gone before. But the friends still wait for a basharat, a sign, a omen, an omen, for they come in such tumultuous times. Zakir thinks that the time has come to write to Sabira, quote, before the parting of her hair fills with silver and the birds fall silent, and before the keys rust and the doors of the street are shut. End of quote and end of paper. So thank you for listening to this.
Thank you so much, Mehr.